So there's a lot to talk about here, and this is an important time for this book to come out because we're in this moment, I think, where many of us have pretty important questions about where China's going. Probably for the better part of the last few decades, I think there was at least some certainty that China was moving upward. This was the concern about a rising China after the global financial crisis. There was a spate of articles, again, on the China model. I remember one recent headline from a news magazine, I think in 2018 or 2019, saying China won, the United States lost. And now we seem to be in a really different moment where many of the questions are about what a stagnating China means for the world. So your book comes in at really an important moment. I wonder if I could first ask you about the origins of the book. Usually authors have a question or a puzzle that they want to explore, and the book is the vehicle to answer that. So when did you first have inklings that you wanted to write this book, and what were the puzzle or puzzles that motivated you to start putting pen to paper?
Well, thanks, Jude. Yes, excellent question. And really, the genesis for this book came about 3 years ago when I was mulling over some of the very striking developments in China. There is, first off, the process of centralization under Xi Jinping, the norm breaking over and over again that we saw. And I saw it really shocked and mystified a lot of China watchers, including me, who did not anticipate these trends. And then I was also motivated in part by my first book, which, I admit it's a lesser known work, perhaps, somewhat technical. But what I did in that book was lay out the process by which the party comes up with plans and implements policy. And just going by that documentation, you would think, I thought, that China had this well thought out strategy and plan to become a great power and was going to execute it. And yet, what I observed over time was that there was this disconnect, profound disconnect between what the Chinese government said it was going, or Communist Party said it was going to achieve on paper, and what actually happened. And it was this growing disconnect between ambition and reality that got me to scrutinize more closely, this process of policy implementation. That's really what I'm looking at is what are the political problems that make it difficult for countries like China to implement policies that could help them become rich and strong.
And when was this when you started first thinking about the book?
About 2019, actually. So before COVID, we had already seen signs that a lot of the fundamental economic problems were not getting resolved. The debt was continuing to grow. The country was not rebalancing to a consumption-based model, and capacity was continuing to be added when it was clear the Chinese government had stated that they're trying to do many of the opposite things.
So maybe it would be helpful to just first lay out the main argument of the book, which is captured nicely in the title, which is the autocrat's predicament. So I've got a lot of more narrow questions, but maybe we can just get this on the table. What is the autocrat's predicament?
Sure. So the autocrat's predicament that I lay out in this book is the predicament that comes with the ambition to upgrade the economy. That is to say, to improve the quality of economic growth. And the predicament lies in that to achieve that growth, the autocrat has to be willing to risk considerable political instability and potentially violence. So on the one hand, he can choose to avoid that instability and violence by tolerating an economic situation that gets worse and worse, or he can decide to risk political instability and violence and ram through some changes. And that brings a lot of its own perils. And this is a predicament that faces all the autocrats that I discuss in the 5 cases mentioned in the book.
And so, digging down a bit deeper, why is putting in place growth augmenting policies challenging for authoritarian political systems? Asking it another way, isn't that exactly what China has been doing since the early 1980s? So why is this a predicament?
Great question. And it really goes to the question of what kind of economic growth policies you're trying to implement. As I mentioned in the beginning of the book, there are generally two types of ways an economy can grow. One is through methods known as extensive growth, that is just adding more capital or labor. And the other is known as intensive growth. And this is essentially improvements in productivity. Countries often can grow through extensive methods fairly easily. It's even autocrats have found it pretty easy to coerce rural populations, for example, to move into factories and start making things, or force capital, extract capital from the people and use that to invest in building roads or growth generating projects. But what happens is that over time, when countries, autocrats, really all countries, when they rely on those extensive growth processes, you start to build up elites, essentially, who benefit from continuing those policies. They accumulate a great deal of wealth and power. And then at some point, when you realize that method of growth is unsustainable and you need to change, often you have a large population of powerful, wealthy elites who have a vested interest in continuing obsolete policies. And this is where the dilemma really comes to a sharp point.
So a lot of the previous literature looking at how autocratic systems reformed often talked about this framing of the selectorate. And I also think of my boss and former boss and mentor, Susan Shirk, who in one of her first books on the political logic of economic reform talked about that the transactional nature of essentially buying political space to push through with economic reform. So you have to compensate the losers. Where does this argument situate within that literature on selectorate theory or some of the previous work that has been done about essentially how reform how reform was able to circumvent or overcome vested interest concerns?
Right. So what's different about the situation that I'm focused on is that in this case, unlike the selectorate theory, and just to review, the selectorate theory says the autocrat, to maintain power, needs to pay off elites, distribute resources to enough of the elites who can decide whether he stays in power or not, that they're satisfied, and then you maintain power. So what's different in the cases that I'm examining is that in order to get those resources, the autocrat has to ask elites to undercut their own interests. So this is what makes it so difficult and such a predicament for autocrats is in order for the country to thrive and for the economy to grow through intensive growth policies, again, that's through higher productivity, what the autocrat has to do is demand that elites curtail their own rent and change their behavior in a way that undercuts their own income and revenue. And so naturally, there is very little incentive for the elites to comply with what the autocrat demands. And this is where a lot of the drama starts to unfold is when the autocrat has to strategize and figure out, how do I compel elites to do what I want them to do in a way that does not result in widespread violence and instability?
So I can imagine a lot of viewers who think about autocratic systems, with dictatorships, strong authoritarian systems, as thinking, well, why is that a problem if you have an incredibly powerful centralized leader? Can't he or she simply just compel, command, either through suasion or through the threat of violence, to get all sort of actors within the political system to follow the leader's dictates? Isn't this exactly what dictatorships do?
So yes, it does. We often think of dictatorships as being incredibly powerful men, but I forgot to mention one of the sources of inspiration for my work was the research of scholars and political scientists like Joel Migdal and Darren Asamoglu, who pointed out that actually authoritarian control can be an illusion because real power often rests with subnational elites who control the day-to-day policy making of economic growth and social stability. And this is often true of single-party authoritarian states. The autocrat is one man. The people who support him are often a small group of central leaders, maybe. And then he's got a massive elite, can, in China's case, include millions of cadres who are well-positioned to dominate local politics and control the actual day-to-day policy of maintaining growth and stability. So what makes it hard for autocrats is he depends on the same people to carry out the policies that undercuts their interests. He doesn't have the luxury of an apolitical bureaucracy, and there is no chance for a election to throw out the leadership and bring in a fresh voice to ram through changes. He has to somehow compel his own politicized bureaucracy to carry out policies that many of the elites find extremely harmful to their own interests.
Do Leninist authoritarian systems have a better ability to deal with this this challenge than more garden variety authoritarian systems? I mean, it seems that one of the ostensible benefits of strict Leninist hierarchy is to have more vertical command over subnational actors, or is your argument that even in a Chinese Leninist system that this problem is pretty extensive?
So here's how where we get into the actual theory that's at the center of the book. So what I propose in my book is this theory of the enabling condition. And what I mean by the enabling condition is this idea that there is an optimal political configuration that is necessary for any autocrat, no matter the regime type, even democracies actually, for them to carry out intensive growth policies. And this optimal configuration consists of a strong central leader, weak elite opposition, and a population with a high mobilization capacity. Now, traditionally, when Leninist regimes were formed, they often showed an impressive ability to mobilize the people, and they had no hesitation in using violence to crush elites who opposed them, in often very bloody, ruthless, and inhumane and just savage ways. Stalin, Mao, these leaders were, frankly, bloodthirsty in their slaughter of their own elites, cadres, and bureaucrats. And in those days, they showed an incredible ability to mobilize popular opinion on their side. So over and over again, Leninist regimes in their infancy showed an impressive ability to carry out incredible schemes, often ill-conceived and catastrophic, frankly, like Great Leap Forward and many of Stalin's ideas. But, what is important for this discussion is not the content of those schemes and those plans, but the impressive ability that those regimes were able to, demonstrate by carrying them out in the first place. But inevitably, what happens in each of these countries is that the government finds this method of rule is simply too unstable, too destabilizing. When you kill elites, eventually the elites start to band together to protect themselves, and you risk civil war, or intra-elite violence, or potentially coup. China had the Lin Biao incident, and in Soviet Union, the violence became so destabilizing that eventually, after Stalin, communist leaders like Khrushchev renounced that approach and proposed a more normal form of politics. Is actually the Soviet term, normal management of cadres. So. And so, what these Leninist regimes do is they forego that violent and volatile and unstable method of rule, which did control elites and did involve the populace, for a more stable form of politics that actually can last much longer, but it comes at a very high price when they make that transition first off, they depoliticize the people. They get the people, they demand the people get out of politics. Deng Xiaoping did this when he adopted the reform and opening policy and start to eviscerate orthodox communism for a market-friendly socialism. And the Soviet Union, of course, after Khrushchev, the Communist Party downplayed the role of the people in getting involved because they wanted to focus more on personal issues and keep them out of politics. That is stable, but it weakens the power of the autocrat considerably. And so by the time they try to carry out intensive growth policies, what can often happen is in that intervening time, the elites will have grown so powerful and the people so fragmented that the autocrat finds his options extremely limited in trying to carry out these growth policies.
Yeah, and we'll get into Xi Jinping a little bit later, because in some ways it sounds like you're describing a situation that he inherited when he came to office. Just a final question or two at the theoretical level. Do you think it is possible for a Leninist one-party state to put in place this intensive growth and still have a party system which retains its resiliency and durability? As you mentioned, you could imagine where you depoliticize a population, you have busted through some of the vested interests, but then you create some of the preconditions or some of the dynamics which can lead to, again, if we're thinking about some of the dynamics that Xi Jinping inherited, dismissal or disinterest in the Communist Party by wide swaths of the population. In Xi Jinping's own internal logic, much of what he's done over the last 10 years has actually saved the party from what was a different fate. So do you think this sort of good growth augmenting policies can exist alongside a permanently stable Leninist one-party system, or are the two at odds?
I'm quite skeptical that it can be done. There are two main reasons. First off, there's the problem of powerful elites, and it is proven extremely difficult for any country to find a way to reduce income inequality and reduce the share of wealth and income that elites have once they reach the proportions that they have in China and they did in the Soviet Union. They just, they with so much resources, they can frustrate, the efforts of the leadership to try to circumvent them or cut them down to size. And then the other problem is the populace. Once they become so fragmented, and what I mean by that is once their employment situation is characterized by a high level of informality, which is happening in China, when their political involvement has been reduced to basically non-involvement, and they are turning to personal pursuits to find satisfaction and no longer believe in the party. And once their social situation is characterized by extremely high levels of inequality, and therefore they are very dependent on the local party bosses, it is extremely difficult. And I cannot think of a case that where there's an example where the autocrat succeeded. It's very difficult to remobilize the people and mobilize them against the elites and carry out intensive growth policies. Incredibly difficult. The one case I cited in my book, Taiwan, just to underscore this point, because Taiwan is very lucky in many ways when it attempted to carry out intensive growth policies in the late 70s. The elites were quite weak relative to the KMT autocrat, and the people were highly integrated into the workforce. It's a very high proportion of formal labor, and the industries were largely domestic and integrated with upstream, downstream linkages. So there's a lot of incentive for many actors to support the upgrading policies, and those incentives don't exist otherwise in most Leninist-run countries.
You've talked about the risk involved for an autocrat in trying to push through these intensive growth policies I'm curious, when does the lack of economic reform and thus economic growth become its own political risk? I think of this because as long as I've been focused on China, I have at various times heard pundits say something to the effect of, if China's GDP falls below X% a year, social instability will break out, and or the Communist Party will lose its legitimacy. I've always struggled with that rigid formula. Firstly, because I remember hearing this when that growth percentage was 8%, and the idea was when they fall below 8%, the party is doomed, and we have certainly fallen below 8%. I'm hearing another round of it, where if it goes any lower than it is now, even if we take that framing off the table, though, I do see there is a good intuition behind the connection between producing economic output and therefore opportunity and how much buy-in the public has into the party. So do you see a political risk the other way of running an economy into the ground and thus inciting sort of mass discontentment?
Absolutely. Again, that's one leg of the predicament is the autocrat can tolerate a worsening situation, the benefit of which is he avoids political instability, does not have to challenge his own elites. But the downside of that is your economy gets worse and worse. North Korea, I think, is an extreme example of the lengths an autocrat has to go to if they don't want to risk political instability by maintaining an just simply unsustainable economic deterioration. It's crushing destitution and just unbelievable human miseries in North Korea. Soviet Union is another example where reforms were put off year after year after year until it degenerated into crisis. And by that point, Gorbachev was really pushing uphill, and his prospects were very bleak in trying to finally carry out the intensive growth changes he had been seeking. China's case, I think we have to bear in mind, it's not really the GDP growth, annual GDP growth number that is important. It is the growth in per capita GDP per citizen. So it is possible that the quality of growth can change, and this is what is appealing about intensive growth policies. If you can improve productivity and improve incomes for citizens, you can get by with a lower annual GDP growth as long as people feel like they are getting their basic needs met and they have opportunity. But and that's exactly why autocrats often want to try to carry out intensive growth policies. It's just that politically it is incredibly difficult to do so.
So the book in its structure has several chapters on theory, and then you have a number of case studies on China, on Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. You look at the Soviet Union, and you look at Taiwan. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into all of these. So I wanted to pick two that I'm most personally interested in, which is to look at Deng Xiaoping, and then I think to look at the president and look at Xi Jinping. So again, you're looking at this autocrat's predicament in each of these case studies facing each of these leaders. Let's go back to Deng. You're talking about the period right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or at the tail end of the Soviet Union, and of course right after China's own domestic turmoil in 1989, including the massacre at Tiananmen Square. So first, can I ask you to lay out what exactly the leadership, what were the debates in the leadership at that time, and what was Deng's theory of the case for why China needed to aggressively move in a pro-market, might be pro-state capitalist direction?
Yes. So, yes. That case study begins around 1991, and what had happened was not only the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the Tiananmen Square massacre. So there was an intense debate in the central leadership, Communist Party of China, over the future direction of China. Chen Yun, who was one of the real lions of the Communist Party at the time, a real senior leader, highly respected, and a rival of Deng. He advocated for a much more conservative economic policy that did not change a lot and that maintained a lot of the features of the command economy. And Deng vigorously opposed that. He said, in his view, that was doomed to fail, and that the hope for the country was to push much more radical changes. He was seeking essentially to liberalize markets for pricing, so that the markets would operate and allow a more efficient distribution of some of the goods on the market. And he advocated for a downsizing of the state sector to free up capital and again improve productivity, and to essentially allow businessmen to start doing business. He also advocated for partnerships with foreign firms and other ideas that the conservatives in the CCP found extremely distasteful, if not just flat out wrong. And so there was a struggle. And in this case, Deng's opposition mainly consisted of a handful of powerful senior leaders in the central leadership and not a whole lot in the rest of the country. There were a couple supporters in some of the poorer provinces, but even though Deng started this situation in 91 without formal control of the military, without formal control of the party, he was, he had some title as chairman of the Bridge, volunteer, Bridge Enthusiast Club or something like that. He didn't have formal titles. He didn't actually have formal control of the military. And yet, what he did have was the tacit support of many cadres throughout the bureaucracy, all the way through the provinces. And he had a lot of goodwill in the public. So when he was driven out of the party, what Deng carried out was one of his widely regarded master strokes of traveling through the southern provinces and appealing to the people, mobilizing popular support for his vision of economic growth and prosperity that could get people out of poverty and open opportunities to get rich. And cadres latched onto this in the provinces, and a lot of the people found this way more appealing than what the orthodox guys in Beijing were pushing. And so after a period of time, Deng mobilized popular support and used the media. His supporters gained control of some of the Communist Party media, and they put immense pressure on Chen Yun and his colleagues to fold, which they eventually did and conceded. And Deng was able to set the conditions to implement his market-friendly changes, and as a result, his reform agenda turbocharged China's growth and set the pattern for many years for them to grow.
On that issue of mobilization, where do you think mass mobilization matters specifically for shaping the decisions of vested interests or recalcitrant forces? Again, if I'm thinking about how many construct a mental map of autocratic systems, why does the public matter? If you're Chen Yun and you're in Beijing and you've got a small conservative bastion who has a chokehold, or at least is able to mobilize an effective, obdurate coalition that is against reform. Deng Xiaoping's down in Shenzhen, and he's getting a lot of press. So what? Where does that actual popular mobilization translate into either a threat to, or at least a cost imposition on conservative forces?
Right. So the key is that the cadres themselves are somewhat up for grabs throughout the bureaucracy. They respond to incentives, and when they see that the autocrat is gaining more and more popular support, and therefore if they oppose the autocrat, they risk the violent reaction of the mob, this can convince elites, cadres, to side with the autocrat. It seems to have more and more popular support on his side. We saw this played out in a very bloody fashion under Mao with his Cultural Revolution, when he mobilized popular support, and he put his finger on specific cadres and elites who were resisting what he wanted to get carried out, the mobs would attack them and kill them sometimes. So, and that's in an earlier, kind of bloody model of this. But we saw in the Deng Xiaoping case that a similar process happened, where at first many of the cadres in control of People's Daily and the daily newspapers, and in control of the actual day-to-day policymaking, they took their cues from Chen Yun and printed what he wanted. But when the Southern media started to show this massive wave of support for Deng Xiaoping, we saw the tone of the coverage change when these cadres started to realize that they were perhaps putting themselves in danger by antagonizing lots of people. They start to change. And then over time, editors were removed as Deng gained more and more support. He was able to place more and more of his supporters in power, and eventually he had all of his opposition evicted and his supporters put in power.
Is a weak elite or a strong elite defined by the number of elite in either that the number of opposition elite, or by the quantity, or by the quality? In other words, one Chen Yun is probably worth a fair number of today's elite who don't have the credibility or power within the system. So if you think about the Central Advisory Commission, of the 1980s, these are some incredibly powerful individuals. Many of them had been on the Long March. They had served under Mao. They knew Deng well. They knew the bureaucracies well. So how do you think about what defines whether elite opposition is strong or weak?
So in the way I measure elite opposition is several ways. First off, what is their share of national income and wealth? Second, what is the degree of collusion vertically and horizontally, vertically from low level to the most high levels of government, and horizontally across business and politics and security sectors? And then what is their stance? Are they opposed or in support of the proposed agenda? I would argue that Chen Yun, in some ways, was a very powerful individual for sure, but he and his supporters actually were quite weak, if measured in the terms I outlined. China was a pretty poor country, and Chen Yun's share of national wealth and income was not that great, relatively speaking. And in fact, his supporters, did not control a lot of money. Their appeals were mainly ideological, so they could not buy a lot of supporters among cadres. They just tried to exhort them and appeal to orthodox communism, which had lost its appeal, frankly. And then the degree of collusion, there wasn't much of a commercial sector for them to tie into. In fact, a lot of the SOEs were very interested in what Deng was proposing because they saw opportunities to get rich, and so they were much more inclined to support Deng. So in many ways, Deng faced a weak elite opposition because the elites often were divided. So Chen Yun and a couple of his supporters opposed Deng, but a lot of cadres, especially at the subnational level, supported Deng and what he was trying to achieve. So Deng faced a fairly weak opposition and was able to mobilize just enough popular support to overturn them.
My Kindle device here, which has all my questions, has just decided to start installing an update. So I'm going to try to wing it from here on out. But
sure.
I wonder if we could transition now to Xi Jinping. You have a chapter on Hu Jintao. We will skip over him, although I suspect we will have to reference him when we discuss the situation that Xi Jinping inherited. So let's put yourself in Xi's position. He comes into power as general secretary in late 2012, president in the spring of 2013, facing now, partly because of Deng's 1990s economic reforms, now commercial vested interests, now because of Hu Jintao's relatively weak leadership, we now have very strong actors within the political system who dominate policy verticals and portfolios. You have a relatively disinterested public in the fate of the Communist Party. The party is sort of in the background. It's there, but taken for granted. And even within the party, you'd have relatively weak ideological adherence to party dictates. Party members are not paying their Communist Party dues. They're not showing up to party meetings. So describe how Xi Jinping then dealt with, or did not, this situation, and how he tried to initially push through some of these economic restructurings.
Yeah, so I think we do have to briefly reference Hu Jintao for context. In many ways, what Xi Jinping attempted to do was a second try at Hu Jintao's agenda. Hu Jintao recognized that the old Dengist formula was unsustainable and that China had to rebalance its economy and move towards a more sustainable basis. And that meant making the economy more productive, increasing the efficiency of SOEs. It meant finding ways to incentivize Chinese people to work harder and develop as professionals and workers. And it meant reducing excess capacity, among other things, reducing debt. Now, what he faced was an extremely unfavorable political situation with a very powerful elite who had enormous share of the country's wealth and income. China was already one of the most unequal societies in the world by the time Hu Jintao entered power, and it only got worse over time. And the population became more fragmented with deindustrialization kicking off around 2011, and many people moving into the informal sector. So Hu Jintao failed to find a way to build this enabling condition, which I predicted in I say in my book, he needs to achieve this sort of optimal configuration to implement these changes. He did not succeed. He was afraid to antagonize the elites, frankly, and try to incentivize them with carrots and tolerate a lot of corruption. All that did was make them grow more and more powerful. And when he did propose reforms, they simply blew him off. It's really astonishing when you read the efforts to reform the state sector, how Csis plans were just ignored over and over again. In the military, Hu Jintao told the military to carry out joint reforms, and they just simply ignored him. It's really astonishing. So Xi Jinping came to power. He saw that. He saw these groups in every single sector had become so powerful, so wedded to the continuation of the old way of doing things that they simply refused to change. And he decided what he needed to do, the carrot approach had failed, and what he needed to do was go back to the stick. And that meant centralizing power, emphasizing his personal authority, not the party as an institution, which in many ways had become beholden to many of these vested interests, and then try to ram through these changes. I think there's some evidence that he made some progress in some of his policies. There was a slight improvement in the share of consumption as a driver of growth. But in many other ways, China's situation did not improve because the elites were still too strong and the people too fragmented for Xi to achieve the enabling condition that I outlined in my book. What has resulted is essentially a stalemate. So Xi is much stronger than Hu was, but the elites are also still quite strong, and the people are too fragmented to be of any help. So what Xi can do at best right now is to keep elites in check and avoid some of the real dangers that Hu Jintao faced in the tail of his career. Remember the Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang collaboration, which was extremely dangerous for ruling authorities, and the increasing disregard of Beijing by all these interest groups. She may be able to avoid that, but it will still be incredibly hard for him to push through intensive growth policies that would really put China on a sustainable growth path.
Who in the Xi Jinping era are the elites?
The elites are primarily subnational cadres, government officials, state bank and SOE leaders who work together, property developers. The elites at the subnational level of a government, business, interlocking variety that really control the reins to day-to-day growth and keep perpetuating policies that are incredibly wasteful and counterproductive for China if it really wants to grow on a sustainable basis.
Can I ask a question about what explains then areas where Xi Jinping has been able to push through pretty significant policy restructurings? If we think about the reform in the PLA, a lot of the characteristics that you've mentioned in terms of elite opposition would absolutely be prevalent and present in such circumstances. So what do you think distinguishes areas where Xi Jinping has been able to overcome elite opposition? Think about the anti-corruption campaign, right, which is still raging today and obviously requires upsetting or smashing the iron rice bowl of cadres in the system. Again, the restructuring of the PLA, which is no mean feat. Why is he able to do it in some areas and not others?
Well, the central government, let's not forget, is mainly responsible for foreign policy and security or military. So that means the PLA's money primarily comes from Beijing. Xi Jinping controls access to resources for the PLA. So yeah, he starts off with a great deal of leverage in that area. It's a kind of leverage he doesn't have for economic policy because 70 to 80% of the budget's government spending and revenue is done at the subnational level. Beijing actually has a very small role to play in overall expenditures for economic development. That's all controlled by the subnational governments. So it's his lack of leverage over the subnational governments that makes it much harder for Xi to compel them to carry out policies that they don't want to carry out. There are numerous examples I cite in my book, but a couple stick in my mind. And one example is that the Xi Jinping government recognized there was excess capacity in coal production, and it wanted to reduce the volume of coal. So they tried, decrees and demanding that all the provinces reduce the number of volume of coal that is produced. And yet, what they found was that the subnational governments and the SOEs and the companies that they worked with, they found a way to lobby the regulatory group that was monitoring all this and get exemptions. And they succeeded to such a degree that actually coal production increased over time. Another example is the repeated injunction by the central government to break down all the interprovincial barriers to trade that local governments and their cronies in the business sector have set up to keep people employed and keep GDP growth really high, but which keeps the domestic market incredibly fragmented. I mean, starting in the 90s, Jiang Zemin issued the exact same decrees and law after law, and they have, from what all evidence suggests, done very little to actually break down these barriers.
Yeah, I remember in 2015, 2016, when China unveiled the supply-side structural reform, which is about tackling overcapacity in cement, steel, coal. One of the things I learned when I was looking into that is the role of steel, cement, coal industry associations as essentially quasi-regulators, but these were all essentially captured regulators because they were deeply intertwined with the precise firms. They were essentially responsible for demanding capacity cuts. But it speaks to the issue that you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of, even if you're incredibly powerful within Beijing, as the old saying goes, the sky is high, the emperor is far away. I wonder, we only have a 7 or 8 minutes left, and I wanted to, while I've got you here, talk about some other issues that are directly related to this, but maybe looking a little bit into the murky future, which is, I think, reading your book and then my own observations, and I think this is probably a banal statement by now because it's conventional wisdom. I don't think there's much hope that the growth picture in China at a structural level is going to undergo a profound transformation because of a enlightened leadership that's going to expend political capital to make these growth augmenting productivity reforms. And in fact, Xi Jinping's increasingly statist techno-nationalist vision probably entrenches some of the structural headwinds rather than overcomes them. I think a big question on the minds of many, and indeed we have you back here tomorrow for a closed-door workshop on this where we're going to ask you, which is, what is an economically stagnating China, how does it behave? And one of the key areas that there is a concern is sort of a wag the dog scenario where as China's economy continues to decline, the leadership will either become more sensitive to external slights or feel that is politically advantageous to lash out against an external actor to try to distract or unify the Chinese people. How do you think about that argument now? Do you see merit in it? And if you do, where are the areas that you see potentially Chinese truculence growing?
Well, I do think a lot about what all this implies for China's trajectory. And a couple of thoughts I have is, first off, I think the succession question becomes really important and I think really risky because in order to maintain this situation of a stalemate between Xi Jinping and all these elites, he has had to personalize his authority. And there's naturally a question of, how does China transition to the next person who can maintain such a high concentration of power to keep the stalemate going? Because I think the stalemate is actually probably China's best case situation. The worst case situation is something that degenerates into a Gorbachev-like situation where the elites become so powerful and the central autocrat too weak to actually discipline them at all, and he becomes in danger of being overthrown or just ignored and sidelined, marginalized as the country heads into crisis. So if that's the worst case scenario, then maintaining a stalemate like China has may be one of the better of the bad options that China has at this point. But it does raise questions of what, how does China transition after Xi, which I am increasingly unsure and a little nervous about. In terms of diversionary war theory, I really am skeptical that will work mainly because of the lack of meaningful connection between the autocrat and the people. Xi Jinping is not Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong had this incredible connection with a lot of Chinese people, and he could mobilize popular support to carry out, often insane schemes, but even carry out wars, and they would follow him. And I do not think Xi Jinping has that kind of personal authority among people, because a lot of people today, Chinese people, by evidence provided in polls and surveys and just reports, a lot of people have lost hope or just have become disillusioned with the party. And they feel their prospects are fairly dim. And there's just less incentive for them to trust Xi Jinping when their personal lives are much more dependent on the local party boss who actually controls access to jobs and whatever benefits are available. So I think it's much harder today for Xi to try to distract the country from its woes by fomenting a war, because first of all, it's very unlikely that the people will buy it. I'm skeptical that people will buy the argument that the war somehow improves their situation, and it could weaken them even further. Certainly, the war in Afghanistan did not help Gorbachev. What it did was empower his antagonists in the military and the party to resist him even further.
I suppose the difference, though, between the example of the Soviet Union and Afghanistan and China would be we would be thinking about conflict in an area of much closer proximity and maybe a long-standing territorial dispute where you might see nationalist sentiment, even if there's opposition to Xi Jinping. The idea of losing Taiwan or some other piece of geography might be enough to unify. I think that's where the concern of Taiwan comes in, and is it is it less that Xi Jinping just decides to send the PLA, over the Taiwan Strait, and more after this coming January, if we imagine we have a victory of, let's say, Lai Ching-te of the DPP, the Beijing just really leverages that, paints this now as Taiwan hurtling towards independence, and that we have to really step up our actions and activity. So it may not be an outright invasion. It could just be ramping up tensions and using, quote unquote, provocations from the U.S. and Taipei as a reason. I don't know if any social science work has been done on Chinese attitudes after the visit to Taiwan by Speaker Pelosi and China's subsequent military exercises. So this is just a anecdotal, speculation. But does something like that appear possible to you?
I think provocation is more plausible than invasion, and they're doing that already, frankly. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that election of another DPP president results in worse tensions between China and Taiwan. I think the problem for that whole idea, though, that China could do something really dramatic regarding Taiwan is that it's not clear that it would really help their standing, Beijing's standing with the people, when a lot of the people's concerns are much more fundamental in nature. Jobs, safety from crime, dealing with corruption, environmental despoliation, or fake foods and products that are killing their children. There's a lot of grievances among the Chinese people about the nature of quality of governance, and many polls by actually the Communist Party that plainly state what the people's top concerns are, and Taiwan is almost never on that list. So if Xi Jinping really wants to bolster his standing, he needs to, he says this is his priority. He needs to find ways to make progress on this domestic governance agenda. And the progress has been pretty uneven, frankly. And that's part of the reason why the Communist Party's level of support is also uneven.
Tim, we only scratched the surface, but I just want to commend the book, which is really rich with insights. Like all good books, it's given a new framework to think about a very complicated country with a complicated future.